Now. Welcome, Professor Beatley. Thank you so much for
Okay,
joining us.
thanks. I hope you can hear me okay. And I'm just realizing that I need to share. I forgot once again to hit that little share sound button. Okay, let's try that one more time. And then we will start. Marian, I hope you can see the screen now.
Yes, it looks great. Thank
Do you
you.
see biophilic cities, cities that love nature?
Yes.
Very good. Okay. Great. Well, thank you all for tuning in. It's great to be with you, and I'm going to talk for about an hour or so, and I've got a lot of slides. I know, Marion, you had mentioned that there's interest obviously in birds and bird-friendly cities, but also in sort of the maybe the larger context of how cities coexist with nature and other lots of non-human lives and life forms, and that's maybe where I'll start. I thought I would talk just a little bit about the idea of biophilic cities, and then transition into talking about birds. You'll see it's all sort of connected for me. So to introduce myself, I teach here in an urban planning department in a school of architecture. I've been teaching here at the University of Virginia for multiple decades. Most of my work in one way or another has to do with nature, planning for nature, incorporating nature into cities, designing nature in, and I will say more about the bird part of it. I'm certainly not a bird expert and can't really call myself a birder, I don't think. I'm a lifelong bird lover, and cities are so important in terms of birds and dangers for birds. And so I think it's increasingly important for urban planners to be thinking about this. So biophilic cities to start, we about 10 years ago or so, we started something called the Biophilic Cities Project, building on this basic idea of biophilia. And most of you probably know this, the idea that we are hardwired to need and want that connection with nature. Here is one of Ed Wilson's definitions, E.O. Wilson at Harvard, or unfortunately now passed away, but a hero for a lot of us. Wasn't the first person to use the word biophilia, but he's really the one who's coined it in the way we think of it today, that this innate connection, affiliation to nature. And so that is the key premise that we start from, that we need and want that nature. And when I think of what I am drawn to, things in this picture, living nature, trees and flowers and butterflies and birds, of course, these are all things that make our lives, delightful and meaningful. And we have increasingly a lot of evidence about the power of nature, having that nature around us. Nature does so much for us. Just a couple of bits of evidence. This is a really interesting study from Brussels from last year, showing the relationship between the size of trees and the crown size of trees and sales of medications for mood disorders and cardiovascular disease. So, in parts of the city where there is greater canopy and the trees are larger, sales are lower for mood medications and cardiovascular disease. So it's not causation, but it's correlation, and we have a lot of growing evidence like this, and not surprising to me when I think about all the wonderful things that looking at trees and listening to birds does for me, in fact. Recent study, recent findings, actually from a really interesting study in Louisville, Kentucky, that you may have heard about, where they planted 800 trees in an underserved neighborhood in that city, and actually medically tracking the positive benefits, medical and health benefits from those trees over a period of time, and just new findings showing this presence of the C-reactive protein, which is something that indicates it correlates with risk of cardiovascular disease again and other health issues. And they're finding actually that the planting of these relatively large trees in strategic places has a huge positive impact. It controls particulate pollutants. It cools the environment, does many remarkable things for us. So the health and medical world is actually beginning to realize how important it is to enlist nature. So exactly why nature has this positive effect on us is we don't entirely know, but there are lots of competing theories and ideas. Some of them have to do with fractals. You see here on the right this idea of fractal fluency. Fractals are these self-repeating shapes and forms, and in nature, the tree that leaf of the tree is a small version of the branch, which is a small version of the larger tree, and we see these fractal patterns in trees and clouds and water and even the flight patterns of birds. And this idea that we have evolved a visual system to effortlessly process these fractals. And so not surprising that we're calm, we have this sort of effortless looking when we watch clouds and when we listen to birds, for example. And that's part of the magic of nature. And so all the things on the right side of this slide are things that the evidence shows um, are results of the presence of nature, of exposure to nature. We know depression levels go down, anxiety goes down, stress levels go down when we have more nature around us. Our mood improves. There's even evidence now that crime rates go down and gun violence decreases. Some evidence coming out of places where they've planted trees and vacant lots. Coming out of environmental psychology, even evidence that in the presence of nature, we're more likely to be generous, we're more likely to be cooperative, to think longer term. A lot of evidence that suggests that we are better human beings, really, when we have this nature all around us. And we're frequently using the word flourishing as a wonderful word, not just the pleasure and pleasures that we get from nature, but the deeper connections and the deeper meaning. Flourishing kind of captures a lot of that for me. Anyway, so there are a lot of good reasons to be spending more time in nature, and it's really interesting to think about the pandemic. We have been tracking a number of cities in real time during the height of the pandemic, and it is interesting how we sought solace outdoors. We actually wanted to see and hear birds and wanted to be walking in forests and in parks and so on. And we have rediscovered nature in many ways, and to such a degree that many of us don't really want to go back into the office. And this statistic of 50% occupancy rate may be a little bit, maybe may not be quite that high yet or now, as more companies are inducing or mandating that people return to the office. But I would rather be where this person is, listening to birds, watching birds, looking at trees, experiencing nature, being immersed in nature. We've gotten to know this group, Nature Desks, based in the Netherlands, and they've been organizing this International Outdoor Office Day now for a while. So they capture images like this of companies that allow their employees to spend time outside. So we believe that cities have to be designed in a way that allows us to have nature all around us, in those places where we spend the bulk of our time, where we're working, where we're living, and that nature is not just this place to visit once or twice a year on a holiday. It literally has to be around us all the time. So we are often talking about something we call the nature pyramid, which is sort of modeled after the food pyramid. You may remember this, the USDA food pyramid that was meant to guide us in our food choices. The things at the top of that pyramid were things we should be eating in small quantities, that are the bulk of our diet should be things at the bottom of that pyramid, the base, the fruits and vegetables and grains. Similarly, we think about nature. So the top of that pyramid, we go off to some faraway place and immerse ourselves in nature during a vacation. Well, we can't really expect our nature diet to be made up of those kinds of experiences. We can't afford the carbon footprint for us to be flying off to some faraway place. We've got to think about what's at the base of that pyramid, and those are the things that we will experience, have around us, experience and enjoy on a daily or hourly basis. And birds are a big part of that nature diet in my mind. This past spring, we had a really interesting experience collaborating with a Belgian public relations firm, actually, who we're working on a national campaign called Daily Dose of Nature, and we helped them to develop a sort of Belgian version of this nature pyramid, which I took out at the last minute, but kind of interesting. They inverted the pyramid and turned it upside down, which is the way that in Belgium, that's the way they learned about the food pyramid. So the basic idea again is that we want that everyday nature. We want the nature to be designed into the spaces all around us where we spend most of our time. That nature, of course, in cities and everywhere does wonderful work for us. There are lots of ecological services provided by that nature. This is an image from Rotterdam, and Rotterdam has to manage water and does that in some really creative ways using nature, like the design of water squares or water plazas. The second image from the left, this idea of creating new green public spaces, gathering spaces that most of the time don't have water in them, and they're used for those public activities, but just a tiny bit of the time fill up with water. So they're designed actually to retain and hold floodwaters. So just about anything that you can do to make a city more natureful, whether installing green rooftops or planting trees and forests, will actually make that city more resilient. And as we're confronting climate change and extreme weather and all the things that cities have to think about today, nature-based solutions are really a big part of that. So in my world of urban planning, urban design, architecture, I'm in the School of Architecture, we've seen just a remarkable interest in incorporating nature into the design of the built environment, and the rise of something we've tended to call biophilic design. So that is thinking about how to bring nature inside, how to design everything in a building so that it incorporates living nature, but also references nature. This is a wonderful example of a hospital, of a cancer center in Toronto, designed by Ty Farrow. You see the living trees, but it's also a lobby that as you walk into it, these mass timber beams are meant to elicit a kind of feeling of being in a forest and a canopy. And so we have lots of wonderful examples of biophilic design and nature integrated into building design. This is another example from Toronto, a couple of hundred trees growing on the terraces, or will grow on the terraces of this building. And this building designed, the floor plates are designed actually so that there's growing space designed in from the very beginning. And a lot of these examples, by the way, we haven't said anything about our network, but we have a global network of cities. 32 cities now have joined as partner cities. If I forget to say this, I would love for you to visit our website, biophilic-cities.org. One of the things we do in our network is to capture stories, and the cities sort of share and inspire each other. And so one thing we found to be really potent is actually making short films about a lot of these stories, these efforts that cities are engaged in, and really wonderful examples here. These are actually three living buildings with three different films, a film about each of these movies, and you can find them on our web page. The Bullitt Center on the left, certified living building, meaning that it's actually required to demonstrate that it's net zero energy, which means it produces at least as much energy as it uses. And this building is now 10 years old, and it's produced 30% more energy than it's consumed. The Frick Center and actually the Center for Sustainable Landscapes at the Phipps Conservatory, the two other examples on this slide. But we say that everything that we build in cities, design in cities, should be biophilic, every building. But a biophilic city is really something more than just a city full of biophilic buildings. It's thinking about nature in a more holistic way. It's thinking about the nature between and beyond the buildings. It's thinking about all those spaces and all that life all that non-human life that can live between those buildings. So we say that a biophilic city is one that fosters connections to nature and to each other. It is a city that emphasizes conservation. We're in the middle of a global biodiversity crisis. Cities can't be the whole answer, but they can be part of the answer. And we believe that there's an ethical duty, in fact, to make space, to make room for other forms of life. I'm going to use the word coexistence a lot in the next few slides. There's a duty to make room and to actively, proactively make space for other non-human life. So the vision of a biophilic city is very much about immersive nature, moving from seeing a city where there are places of nature that you walk to or you go to, like a park, and thinking rather more holistically that we are living in the park, we're living in the forest. We are the forest, we are the ecosystem. This is an image from Singapore, one of our original partner cities, and they've maybe taken this idea the furthest in our network. They, for many years, called themselves a garden city. More recently, they have changed their motto. They call it to calling themselves a city in a garden, which seems like a small change, but it's really quite profound. And more recently, a city in nature, and sometimes a biophilic city in nature, and a whole host of planning policies to help bring that about. What you see here is a wonderful example, a project called the Park Royal Hotel, a great design firm called WOHA that designed this. So if you build a building in Singapore now, there's something called the landscape replacement policy. So if you have to at least show that you're going to replace the nature lost at ground level with the same amount or more nature in the vertical realm. So in this case, this building has replaced it to 2 to 1 or 200% in the form of sky gardens and green rooftops and all the sort of nature that you see here. So if I had to summarize what a biophilic city is, it's a city of immersive nature. That nature is integrated, continuous, and seamless. It's integrating built and natural environments together. It's whole of city, meaning it's room or rooftop to region or bioregion and all of the scales in between. It's whole of city, but it's also whole of life. So as a young person, as a child, you ought to get exposed to nature, have those connections, that contact with nature from an early age, through adulthood and into your elder years. So through the entire all phases of your life. It's parks, but beyond parks, it's biodiversity, it's wildness. It's not just the presence or absence of nature, but how much do we interact with that nature? How much do we care about that nature? So we talk about the culture of biophilia. And then in American cities, we know that nature is not evenly or fairly distributed. So we often talk about socially just biophilia. We know that if you look at tree canopy cover in most American cities, it tracks very well the historic redlining maps. So neighborhoods of color, underserved neighborhoods have historically had less canopy, fewer trees, less nature, and as the evidence shows now, actually less contact, fewer birds, and less bird song. So as I say, there is a biophilic-cities.org webpage with a lot more information, lots of case studies, each adjoining city has their own page, and there's a lot of information about each city. We do lots of things in the network, events, webinars, monthly partner calls. There's usually a celebratory event that happens when a city joins. This is a city councilman in Raleigh, North Carolina. Raleigh joined 2 years ago. We had a big event at the Dorothea Dix Park on Earth Day or Earth Week. And again, lots of the films I've mentioned. And there's a wide variety of different things that our cities are doing. The opportunities are different from place to place. The nature is different. The climate is different. The ecology is different, and the politics are different. So here's just a sort of sampling of some of the cities and some of the things that they're in fact doing. So I did want to talk a little bit about coexistence and maybe a little bit about wildness. These are really important qualities in a biophilic city. This is an example from Perth in Western Australia. of a downtown central city water feature, typical kind of highly chlorinated, energy intensive, biologically sterile water feature that was converted to what is now a pretty wild space with lots of native flora and fauna and birds included in that, and really a biodiverse wetland in the middle of the city. So we know it's possible to rewild or regenerate nature in many natural spaces and in cities. And that's a big part of what our cities are doing. Another example from our partner city, Vitoria-Gasteiz, the capital of the Basque Country in Spain. This is actually a small river that they have daylit, brought back to the surface, was in a pipe, and doing all kinds of important work, important habitat now, and actually drawing people along this pedestrian and bike way. Or the Cheonggyecheong River in Seoul, which is about a 12-kilometer long, wonderful story of an elevated highway taken down, and in its place, this historic river brought back to the surface, and really, really wonderful. There's what the highway used to look like. So in a lot of our cities, what we're talking about is rewilding, regenerating. This idea of a regenerative nature in cities is really an important part of what we're aspiring to, and this vision of biophilic cities. But coexistence again is a big part of this. The idea that we want and need to have non-human life around us. We want to see cities as supporting biodiversity. Back to Singapore, just a few quick examples before I move on to birds. The now more than 80 smooth-coated otters that are returned to the city, largely because of the restoration of the Kalang River that you see on the left. We have about a 50-minute film about the Singapore story if you're interested on the webpage also. So there's and then actually a film about the otters. I'd love for you to watch that as well. So this river was basically a sort of engineered hard surface flood control project, and now it's been returned to a meandering, wonderful biodiverse river with lots of birds and butterflies and dragonflies, and it's doing on the left in this image, doing what it's supposed to do, which is to retain and store floodwaters. It's done a really good job there. Another story of coexistence in our partner city, Austin, Texas. Many of you know about the 1.5 million Mexican free-tailed bats that have taken up residence under the Congress Avenue Bridge in that city. We have a film about that also. Here, a change in philosophy, thanks in part to the work of people like Merlin Tuttle and Bat Conservation International. First reaction of the city was to want to eradicate the bats and seeing them as a health risk. But of course, today, hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, it seems, come to the city, and they wait for the sun to go down and the bats to emerge in long columns in a very, very dramatic fashion. Edmonton, Canada, another wonderful story of coexistence. Here, they have been emphasizing ecological connectivity in almost all the planning that they do. Use of circuit theory and circuitscape modeling, this idea of looking at your city kind of like a circuit board. Are there places where there are disconnects? Are there places where the tree canopy doesn't connect, and places where maybe birds or other urban wildlife would have trouble moving through the city? I love the idea actually of looking at this city through the perspective of a chickadee. And so in Edmonton, when you build anything, and certainly a new road, you are now required to incorporate wildlife passages. So thinking about how wildlife and biodiversity can move through the city, really interesting. There are now probably more than 35 wildlife passages, and what they have discovered, they weren't necessarily doing it for this reason, but pretty sharp reduction in car wildlife collisions as a result. So a number of cities are beginning to do these kinds of things. And Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles, one of also another recent partner city. And most of you know, I think, the story of the mountain lions. This is the famous P-22 mountain lion, and beginning to design the large probably the largest wildlife bridge in the world when it's done, and many other things to coexist, including a really remarkable set of biodiversity guidelines. Happy to share, by the way, if there's anything that you'd like to see later, and we can send you links or material. I'm going to go quickly, but this is a comprehensive set of guidelines for all agencies in the city, and there is a part of it that has to do with bird-friendly design as well. So coexistence can also mean renaturalizing cities, can also, depending on the species. We've just made a little film about beavers, and beavers, we nearly, caused their extinction in North America, but we're now appreciating that they are wonderful ecological engineers, and we want them in cities, and they create wetlands and enhance biodiversity. And so this is actually part of the film. This is a golf course in Atlanta, and it has actually become a very popular birding site because of all the birds that have returned because of this really dramatic improvement in the habitat and the kind of wetland and watery environment that's been created here, and the golf course is continuing to function as a course. So I'd love for you to look at our film about beavers. We mostly spend time with a researcher in Atlanta who's done some wonderful work actually demonstrating how beavers help, the beaver dams and beaver water systems actually help to moderate stormwater. And she says, talks in the film about how beavers, they're working all the time. So when a storm comes through and the structures are damaged, you don't have to wait for humans to go out and repair them. The beavers are working all the time. So we know also that there is a sense of awe and wonder, and people love watching beavers. So the imagery, the footage you're watching now is from filming we did in Seattle last summer. And this is a little park in Seattle where we've discovered that the residents are so enamored of these beavers that they time their dog walks and their visits to the park so that they can see them and watch them, and they're pretty charismatic, to be sure. So we've gotten to know a lot of beaver researchers. This is someone, Emily Fairfax, who's been doing a lot of work around the fire mitigation benefits of beavers. And in the interest of time, I think I'll flip through it, and not that there's a little film that she's made about that. So on to birds. So I think these are mostly things that this audience will already know, but I've already made the pitch that I think that urban planners and urban designers and architects need to be thinking about birds. And of course, there are many dangers birds face. Marianne mentioned I think the Bird Friendly City book. Maybe you didn't, but there is a book called The Bird Friendly City. And there is a code from Island Press if you're interested. It's bird-friendly. That should give you a 20% discount on the book. But this is a 2020 book, and I when I started this, began to realize there really wasn't much literature that was aimed at cities and aimed at urban planners and mayors and urban managers of various kinds. And then tapping into my own sense of what makes for a good city. And I would argue that it is the presence of birds. And if I forget to say this, I often say everywhere I go that we need to judge the goodness of a city by the ability of its residents to hear native birdsong in every neighborhood of that city. That ought to be a metric for us. This is one of my favorite sounds, the wood thrush. I wait for it every spring. There up in the corner are the dates for the last 5 years of the first time I hear it in Charlottesville, here where I am in Charlottesville, Virginia. A little sooner, the last couple of years, maybe that's climate change, but it animates the spaces around us here in this city, and birds, of course, do that. We have a lot of evidence about the power of seeing birds, but also hearing birds. I'm going to go very quickly in the interest of time. We know there are all these studies that have kind of simulated, we enjoy, we rate the restorative value of spaces as higher when we have bird song, more bird song, and the more species of birds we think there are, the more restorative are the qualities of those parks and those green spaces we visit. The reference to birds shows up in real estate advertisements. This is actually a little study from Wellington, New Zealand. Wellington is another one of our partner cities. Wonderful bird stories there. So references actually to the presence of native parrots that are actually returning to Wellington because of some of the conservation work that they have been doing. So we know, I've already made the pitch that the more nature we have around us, the lower anxiety, the lower the stress, we see lower levels of depression, all these very positive mental health benefits in particular, and we need to appreciate that birds fall into that important category as well, do such important service for us, and really make life, meaningful. And back to that word flourishing, I think. So you all know that birds are not doing well, and 50% of bird species and globally are in decline. I'm sure you all know about the study. We were shocked, in 2019 when we got the results of this, that we'd lost a third of our bird abundance, and since 1970, really shocking. There isn't, of course, one single thing. It is a whole bunch of things working together, as you all know. It's climate change, it's habitat destruction, it's overuse of pesticides and herbicides, it's light pollution, a lot of things. But I think actually that we sometimes, many of us, get just frustrated that there's so much going on in the world that we don't have any control over. And my message, and talking to especially urban planning and kind of city audiences, is there are many things that you can do in support of birds, and these are some of the things that are part of the sort of list of things that should be priorities for us as we imagine what a bird-friendly city is or could be. And the idea of a bird-friendly city, of course, there are state bird city certification programs in the U.S. I have to give a lot of credit to Canada. Nature Canada has a national certified bird-friendly city program. I serve on their advisory board and has actually participated in a number of the actual certification, the processes of evaluating. There are mandatory standards, not to go into this in too much detail, some that are listed here. You have to have a city website, you have to have a bird team, and then there's variable scoring based on these three sort of broad categories: threat reduction, habitat protection, community outreach, and education. And there are 30 cities now that have reached certification. So it's I'm quite impressed with it, and it's inspiring and gives a really comprehensive comprehensive sense of what makes up a bird friendly city. So just to talk a little bit further about some of the kind of key things, again, topics that I think you all mostly know about. Clearly, there are really important dangers. We know that something like 1 billion birds are killed each year by hitting windows, hitting buildings, building collision. A really big impact, but something that we know what to do about. So this is actually an image from a relatively new building in New York City from just a month or so ago. And what do birds see? They don't see that glass as a barrier. They see the reflected cloud or the reflected tree. But there are many things that we know we can do. The book talks about some of the really inspiring stories, in particular the story of FLAP, this organization in Toronto that started this collision monitoring pretty early. Volunteers walking the base of buildings on a set path during peak migration, collecting dead and injured birds, and many other cities have followed the lead. So getting a handle on the extent of the problem is a big step in these cities. In the case of FLAP, doing the sort of visually striking thing of collecting all the birds and displaying them and getting headline stories in the paper and raising awareness about just about every species of every size is threatened, and the giving a visual impression of just the magnitude of the problem and building the political will to do something about it. So we know what to do, and buildings like the Jacob Javits Convention Center in New York, shining examples of what is possible. We're literally shining here, but this is a building that has retrofitted all its glass with fritted glass, so having a pattern baked into that glass that birds can see. We know that the evidence is pretty compelling, pretty clear that we need a pattern density that's at least 2 inches by 2 inches, and birds will see that. And there has been a remarkable reduction in bird mortality at this building after the installation of this new glass. And then, by the way, also at the same time, the installation of a green roof, which is being studied and is turning out to be pretty significant nesting habitat for many birds coming into the city. So I've already made this point. There are, of course, lots of different kinds of window treatments that will create patterns that birds can see. We have a short film, I think I mentioned, about the Frick Environmental Center, which you see here in Pittsburgh, and in the book, the very interesting story of a high school group that a volunteer group that basically decided to retrofit this side of the building that was a problem for birds. And they did it. They designed this system. They installed it. It's essentially a paracords that are draped from above. A very inexpensive system, and yet very effective. There are other products, of course, Ornilux UV patterns, and that actually mimic spider webs. I've got some samples of them here in my office. I have become a big fan of Feather Friendly. Many of you know about this Canadian firm. I've got some samples here. We have been retrofitting some of the glass in the building I'm sitting in right now. This our cafe, and it is essentially it's a roll. It's rolled up. You have these little dots between two plastic layers. You pull one layer off, attach the other part of it, and then pull the second layer off, and all that's left are the little dots, essentially, that provide that pattern density that birds can see. So this is actually the installation of Feather Friendly on our cafe windows here in Campbell Hall at UVA. Some windows have been treated with art. You see, actually, a group of students did the windows on the right. It doesn't have to cost a lot. This is the Discovery Center in Philadelphia, which has become a great place to display and test different window treatments, and their estimate for the paracord system you see here on the right, about $12 a window. So not very expensive to retrofit. Michael Mazur of FLAP likes to talk about how if we made buildings more bird friendly, we would also make them more architecturally interesting. And I think he's got a point. So this is what was the Ryerson. It's now changed their name. It's now the Toronto Metropolitan University, but it's their student center, and it's got this elaborate design facade that actually creates this sort of layer that birds can see. So there are lots of different things that we could do. This is a building called the Interface Base Camp. It's the Interface Carpet headquarters in Atlanta. We have a 7 or 8 minute film about this on the webpage as well. And the most striking thing about it is this polyester sheathing that basically creates a picture of a full-sized eastern forest But it creates all kinds of wonderful dappled light inside, and it does a number of things for the building. It makes it very distinctive, and people see it as they go by it. But birds see it, so it's actually a bird safe treatment as well. So the trend is in a positive trend is in the direction of cities like New York City mandating the installation of bird friendly glass and bird friendly facades. Toronto was really the first North American city to do this. San Francisco, the first American city, U.S. city. But New York, with local law 15, the largest city. And so it applies to the first 75 feet from ground level up, the most dangerous part of buildings, and then mandates around additional height around green roofs. So that's one thing we can do. We also want to incorporate habitat wherever we can. And that, again, Jacob Javits' green roof, little imagery here about that, and some published studies now about the bird nesting on that site. And so we're always collecting stories about this and how we can incorporate habitat and begin to think of buildings like forests. This is Kampong Admiralty, one of my favorite buildings in Singapore. If you look down on it from above, it's got this sort of tiered tropical forest on the roof. You wouldn't know there was a building there. Well, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's bird friendly and bird habitat. Or the new St. John's Terminal. This is a new Google building that incorporates a lot of really wonderful native vegetation. And New York Audubon, or what was New York City Audubon, now the Bird Alliance, has already recorded over 40 bird species in this kind of multi-layered exterior native vegetation designed into the building. The book talks about some examples from Europe where they've done a lot to incorporate bird habitat and bird nesting boxes into the actual design of building facades. This is a wildlife friendly project in the UK. Really interesting that this is developed by a company called Barratt Development. It's actually the largest home builder in the UK, and they've pledged to make every new development wildlife friendly, and it will include birds. So the common swift is not doing very well, and these are little pre-made swift bricks that actually just fit into the brick pattern, and they work pretty well. And so it's interesting to hear how prospective buyers are actually choosing their house based on wanting to have swifts living in the facade of their home. A bit of a negative story just the last couple of days. We've been communicating with folks in the Netherlands. They've had a proposal to require new buildings to incorporate habitat for sparrows and several other species, and common swifts or European swifts as well. And here you see the headline translated: "No mandatory nesting box for house sparrows, bats, or swifts in new construction." This was the decision of one of the ministers just a couple of days ago. So the worry is about what does this mean for the price of buildings, or the cost of buildings and the cost of housing. But I think they're going to pass it eventually, and that's the trend. I'm a big fan of chimney swifts, and a whole Canadian story of how they have been mapping swift nesting and roosting sites, and actually helping to subsidize the rebuilding and preservation of large chimneys that are important swift sites. And this is actually a Montreal company that's developed actually a chimney cap that incorporates habitat for the swift, but also basically caps the chimney, which of course capping chimneys has been been detrimental, and at least in the U.S. So light, of course, is another thing we can do something about. We have a huge light pollution problem here in the U.S. Many cities, or a number of cities now, have voluntary lights out programs. A couple of years ago, or 3 years ago now, I guess, that deadly one night loss of birds at the Chicago Convention Center, the McCormick Place, was a wake-up call for a lot of folks who hadn't quite appreciated that lights were had such a powerful impact in drawing birds in and creating, dangerous conditions and impact with windows and so on. So we need to be turning off lights. I'm going to skip through some of this. Happy to share the slides later and have you look at them a little more carefully. I realize this is going pretty fast. So Philly, just one of the newest cities to start a voluntary lights out program. Pretty interesting. Our partner city, Raleigh, North Carolina, one of the few, maybe the only example I can think of a city that has adopted a municipal policy of turning off municipal lights on municipal facilities during peak migration. And it's I think a policy that many other cities should adopt. What else can we do? Well, in the book, there's a lot of discussion about backyard habitat programs, and a big one in Portland that I spent some time talking about. They exist all over the place. The idea of reimagining your lawn or your backyard, your front yard as a bird habitat, really important things that we can do, and for a lot of reasons, including reducing energy consumption, water consumption, particularly in Western states. So there are wonderful things we can do, but there are obstacles as well. So back to Toronto, that very progressive bird-friendly city has for many years had on the books a bylaw, a weeds and tall grass bylaw that basically made it illegal to grow a native plants garden like the one you see here. This is actually Nina Marie Lister's garden on the left. And she had a city inspector come and tell her that was illegal, and so she's a planning professor, and she couldn't believe it, and that somebody official from the city would say to her, take out that what you're doing, you're actually doing something to improve the quality of life of your neighborhood as well as for birds. And so she fought it and ignited a whole sort of discussion about this. And so now the city has established a right to plant native gardens like this. We have lots of things we could do to incentivize bird-friendly landscaping and vegetation. And one of the most interesting examples, I think, is Marco Island. We've written about this in our Biophilic Cities Journal. In fact, the book has quite a bit of discussion about burrowing owls. There's a chapter about burrowing owls, mostly having to do with Phoenix. Very interesting owl restoration story in the city of Phoenix. But here in Marco Island, they have created a homeowner subsidy. Basically, they pay homeowners. It's not a lot of money, but if you have a burrow, and you're hosting a family of burrowing owls, there is an annual payment that the town will give you, will offer you, and I really kind of like that idea, although it does seem that the people are doing it for not doing it for the money so much, but a wonderful story anyway. So the last examples that I have, I'm going to look at the time. Marianne, how are we doing on time? If you're
Great.
still there.
You have plenty of time, and
Okay.
keep going. This is fascinating.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple of sips of tea. So yeah, part of the habitat for me, the question of bird-friendly cities has also to do with conservation of trees and forests. And so we're in the midst of creating a new Center for Forest Urbanism here at UVA and here in the School of Architecture. And so we've been doing a lot of work around that, and there are clear, of course, intersections. And I'm frequently saying that you're not going to have birds if you don't protect your trees. We know that. I mean, and I'm a big fan of Doug Tallamy. Many of you are as well, probably. I got to interview him for that bird-friendly Bird Friendly City book. He is a major advocate for planting native trees. And I hadn't fully appreciated. I've always been a big fan of oak trees. My favorite tree, like his, like he is the white oaks, and those white oaks, of course, as his research demonstrates, are just absolutely essential for feeding those young birds during the nesting season, right? So that white oak that's going to be habitat for 450 species of butterflies and moths that generate the caterpillars that those nesting birds are being fed. And so it's really important for us to be planting those native and protecting those native trees. So really interesting synergies or mutualisms. That blue jay that I grew up loving, that we had a masting year here in Virginia for oak trees that they produced a tremendous crop. The blue jays eat them, and they've evolved a beak to penetrate the husk of those acorns. And as Talamy, talks about, each of these blue jays, they bury, many acorns, and they are major seed dispersers. And so that's where the mutualism kind of comes into this. So we need to do a much better job in almost every city in protecting our trees. And so the good news is that in my part of the world here, Eastern U.S., we've largely seen the regrowth of much of our eastern forest, and that's good for heat, good for climate change, but the bad news, of course, is that in cities, almost every one of our cities in our network has seen decline, sometimes quite extreme decline in tree canopy, and that includes my own city here. So Charlottesville has gone from about 50% tree canopy cover to about 35% now, and it's continuing to go down. So we have a challenge in cities, and so this is a very personal example from my neighborhood of a homeowner who cut down 3 very large, beautiful trees for no particular reason that I can see. And part of this has to do with the psychology around trees, which is that they are private property. They are largely the domain of the homeowner. They are how you treat them is seen as an individual decision. We don't tend to see these trees as part of a larger community forest, which they are, providing significant cooling and other ecosystem benefits and birds. So my wife had this idea that I should paint, something like this on the stump. Why? I haven't done that. I don't think it's probably a good idea. But it is clear to me that part of the challenge that we have, if again, back to birds, if we're interested in protecting birds, having birds in our neighborhood, we need to change the psychology of how we think about and look at trees. So I now commonly am going out of my way actually to compliment neighbors on the trees they have. And I do think there are ways that we can change the psychology. It's not likely that this person would have cut down these trees had they had the appreciation or had the sense that their neighbors were enjoying them, valued them, articulated that love of those trees. So we've been trying to document the ways in which we can build and grow. We do have a housing crisis. We have an affordable housing challenge. In almost every American city, those cities are modifying their zoning, right? They're shifting away from exclusive single family zones, increasing the permitted density in some cases, quite dramatically. That's good, but it may not be good in the short term for trees. But we do believe that you can have both higher density housing and you can also have trees. So this is a film about a project in Seattle, film we made last summer, a place called Bryant Heights. I'd love for you to watch that film. It's also on the Bioflake Cities page. It is a wonderful story where the architects actually shifted the buildings around and they made these large trees the centerpiece. And so that Douglas fir on the left becomes the sort of central courtyard. They moved on the image on the right. They actually set back the buildings to protect this existing grove of trees. They moved the parking around. So they basically started with the trees and fit the design of the development around the trees. And that's almost always the other way around. Developers come in and knock down the trees and then they build and then they design. So that's part of the story. Part of what we need to do, we need stronger tree codes. I will say that's another really important part of the story. We need to activate neighborhoods. We need to change the psychology. We've made a short film about this person, Deborah Pearson, and she is a homeowner in Atlanta, and she has a little forest behind and around her house that she's opened up to the public and to the neighborhood. And she's this fierce advocate for trees. And this is really a remnant old growth forest in Atlanta. And so when we met with her, she actually told us a story about her next door neighbor who she heard a chainsaw and discovered that her neighbor had hired somebody to cut down a beautiful mature white oak tree in her front yard. So she went running to her neighbor, imploring the neighbor to stop it. And she was able to stop the cutting of that tree. So we actually saw a couple of places where big branches had been sawed, but the tree was still intact. It's going to take, as I sometimes say, it takes a wooded village to protect and conserve. But it also does take tree codes. And so yet another film that we've recently made in Atlanta is about the really interesting process they have there. They have a pretty strong tree code already, but there you can get a permit. If you get a permit to cut down a tree, you have to put out a notice of that, and your neighbors actually can appeal that decision. They can appeal it to something called the Tree Conservation Commission, and they have a certain period of time to appeal it, and then it goes to this commission, and they can reverse the decision. So the image on the right is essentially an example of that. This beautiful red oak, southern red oak, I think. And the developer who was going to build the house that you see, originally sought to cut down this tree. And when it was appealed, the commission, which has landscape architects and other kind of tree, advocates, figured out pretty quickly that if you just shifted the driveway from one side to the other and moved the house back just a few inches, that you could save the tree. And that's what they proposed, and that's what happened. So we need stronger codes as well, and we need to enlist lots of different communities in this struggle. Another story that we've recently written about is this Peace Park connected to a church, Still Meadow Community Fellowship in Baltimore, where they basically had a 10-acre forest. And the pastor, you see him here on the lower right, didn't even know about the forest until he arrived. And they've basically enlisted the church, its congregation, coming out on weekends and planting trees and helping to restore the site and shepherding over this 10-acre forest. They're going to be 10-acre forests all over. It's partly neighborhoods, but it's partly those other community institutions and organizations like churches that will have to be part of the answer as well. So there are so many tree and forest stories. You may have followed the rise of this movement to plant tiny forests in cities, and I've become a big fan of this idea. Microforest, tiny forest, pocket forests, there are lots of different words for them. They are essentially so-called Miyawaki forests. These are forests where the trees, relatively small trees, are planted very densely, very close together. They sort of have this forced competition. They grow quickly. Their roots intertwine. You get a mature forest pretty fast. And these end up being really remarkable spaces for birds. it turns out. The evidence is pretty interesting. There have been some big studies in Europe. So we have a film about tiny forests as well. Would love for you. You could spend. I've basically given you about 20 films to watch as your homework. This guy figures prominently in the film about tiny forests. He's in the Netherlands. Until recently, he ran a nonprofit. They have been planting hundreds of these forests in the Netherlands. And as an example of what you can do in sort of rewilding cities, this is a really dense Miyawaki forest that took 20 parking spaces and converted them into this forest, 1,100 trees, 35 different species, and what was otherwise a pretty sterile urban environment. And there are a lot of birds there as well. So we have just planted our sixth tiny Miyawaki forest here on the grounds of UVA. And some of these events we've had 100+ students show up to plant trees in about an hour, 2 hours, to plant them pretty quickly. So my Dutch colleague even has started a tiny forest in a box company. So there's no forest too tiny maybe for this. So there's so many other forest stories. Let's see, it is a little after 8. I should probably stop in just a few minutes. So our newest partner city is Busan in South Korea. 3.3 million person city, so one of our bigger cities, and it is a remarkable national story of how they have regenerated their mountain forests following the Korean War. They were devastated, and it became a kind of act of patriotism to replant these forests, and they are just a spectacular backdrop. So 70% of the country is in protected mountain forests, and there's a love of trees and mountains in this country. So Busan City is trying to expand and extend these forests, and they actually several South Korean cities now are planting trees to try to promote. They call them urban wind path forests, to try to bring the cool air down from the mountains into the heart of the city. So it's becoming a kind of strategy for addressing urban heat. So that's pretty interesting, and a lot of really creative ideas for pocket forests in that city in Seoul, tiny forests that can create a kind of network of forests. The upper middle image is actually a forested highway cap, which is something we're starting to see in cities that, particularly where you're running out of space to plant trees and forests, capping a highway, which controls the pollution and the noise, can actually create new space in cities. Okay, I guess the last thing, I left the most controversial part of the book maybe to the last, and we can talk. I'll talk just a couple of minutes and we can stop here. But so this is Violet. This is actually my cat, and this is a picture from the book. And as most of you know, I think that I gave that statistic of 1 billion birds dying each year from window and building collisions. It's probably, we know the estimates are rough, but 3 or 4 billion killed by cats, and what to do about that. There are a few stories in the book, and I've got an image later about the Catio tour in Portland. Catios are one opportunity, and that's an example. Actually, the Feral Cats Coalition of Oregon and what was Portland Audubon, now Portland Bird Alliance, I think, collaborated together. So we are, many of us are bird lovers, but also cat lovers, right? And what to do about that. So there are a range of things we can do. Listed some of the main ones listed here and talked about in the book. My cat has a rainbow collar on right now, something we've used and worked pretty well. I will say, and there's evidence that birds are better able to see cats, and there's a There's a bib product as well that we have used also where cats are able to walk, but if this rigid bib makes it very difficult for them to jump or lunge. And I think they're pretty effective as well. So there are things like that. Keeping cats indoors, of course, is a controversial discussion for us to have. I was really interested to learn in my working with the bird friendly city program in Canada, Nature Canada program, that almost every major city in Canada, this might not be, I may be exaggerating a little bit, but it's quite common to have what they call a no roaming bylaw, basically a municipal law mandating that you keep your cat indoors. And there are fines, and there are various levels of enforcement. So that is something that can be done as well. Here is the Catio tour. We have a short film about this as well, where we basically follow every year. There is this Catio tour. It's kind of like a garden tour, where you buy a ticket, and then you get to go to 10 different Catios and see the variation and what they look like. And some are small and not very elaborate. Others are quite large. And but it's a cat patio, an enclosed structure that lets your cat be outside, but also protects birds from them. And sometimes they're quite elaborate and connected to the house, and they're, walking ladder, little ways of the cat getting from inside to outside and so on. So again, I know this is about the 30th time I've said watch the film, but it is done some interviews with the people that you see here, and they speak quite compellingly about it. So I mentioned Wellington, New Zealand, and in the same vein as the question, what do we do? This is a really interesting story of how they've taken a large wild area, actually a former reservoir, and rewilded it, and kind of in the middle of the city of Wellington, and they've erected a predator-proof fence. You see it in the lower right, and encircling this preserve. And the fence goes into the ground, and it goes up to the air with a structure on top. And it's basically been very effective at keeping domestic cats, feral cats, but also non-native Australian possums and all the stoats and all the non-native European animals that were brought over that have so decimated the native species of birds in New Zealand, right? And it's been working. It's really quite remarkable. And so I mentioned the parrots. There's a kaka here. People are experiencing these parrots, seeing them for the first time in their front yards and hearing them. And so the latest part of the story is they've got kiwi. They basically returned kiwi to Wellington. So it's a wonderful story in that way. And by the way, this rewilded area is called Zealandia in the middle of the city, and their tagline is bringing birdsong back to Wellington, which I love. So we do have a new film about coyotes also on the webpage, and here maybe is bringing full circle coexistence, and we can talk about how we coexist with coyotes. Almost every American city has coyotes now, and they weren't native to the U.S., or to the eastern U.S. But this film about coyotes is about the Atlanta Coyote Project, and so they are very much in Atlanta, partly because the apex predator, the red wolf, no longer exists there. But I asked Chris Mowry, who is the co-founder of the Atlanta Coyote Project, is Atlanta a better city because of coyotes? And he said yes. And I tend to agree. And I tend to think that we can and should make space for coyotes. And the idea that we might hear that coyote family, we might catch a glimpse. We have tried and true, techniques for coexistence. We don't feed. We don't, we have to educate. Coyotes have to continue to fear humans. So we know what we need to do. but it's really interesting to think about how the presence of coyotes might also help us with birds, because we have evidence that where there are coyotes around, domestic cats, tend to stay closer to home and don't tend to roam as far and are not as likely to have predation, have those impacts on killing birds. So we can have coyotes and help control the negative impacts of cats as we celebrate birds. So the last few slides are really more about how we can together enjoy birds, and the story of this community, Aldea in Santa Fe, near Santa Fe in New Mexico, in the book as well. And then I think the last story is the Voxus Swifts in Portland. This is the last time, I promise, I'll say watch the film. But there is a film about this, thousands of these Voxus Swifts, roost at the end of the evening in this large chimney of the Chapman School, and hundreds of people come out every night to watch this happen, and it's really wonderful, and it's dramatic, it's really amazing, it's awe-inspiring. And the night we were there filming, it was fascinating to see it. The estimate was that there were 6,000 Voxus Swifts roosting in that chimney that evening. And at a certain point, as the swirl, these swirl around forever until they finally kind of fall into the chimney. Not quite falling, but at a certain point, a Cooper's hawk came over and flew and perched on the top of the chimney, and everybody in the crowd booed, and then the hawk hung around for a little while and then flew away, and everybody applauded, and sort of this drama. I mean, we support the Cooper's hawk as well, of course, but everyone there was, kind of wanting to see the Voxus Swifts. So the kind of awe inspiring events like this are really important, and an important way of thinking about what a biophilic city is. So we have a bird-friendly page on our Biophilic Cities page that has a lot more information, and that's a good place to stop. And that is, I actually got through all my slides, I think. So, all right. Is there
Great, thank
time?
you. Yeah, so we do have a few minutes for questions.
Okay.
If you do have a question, could you please enter it in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen? And it's a question mark next to just the bottom with all the icons. And going to ask any questions. I do realize that I think the time was wrong for some of the uh, people logging in through reading about the program through Zoom, and so some people might be joining right
Oh,
now. And
no.
yeah, I know. I just realized that. I'm so sorry. But yeah, if you have any questions, just enter them. And I have a question. You
Sure.
mentioned the uh, committee you're on that helps
Mm,
accredit uh,
right.
different buildings. I forgot the accreditation
Yeah, it's
program.
Nature Canada. And
Yeah,
it's the bird friendly cities.
I had a question about LEED, and I
Mm,
don't know if you're familiar with them as an
yeah,
School of Architecture. And I was just thinking through your presentation about biophilic cities that some of the climate-focused solutions or
yeah,
energy-focused solutions might sometimes come into tension with bird-friendly
yeah,
solutions.
right.
And we have a collision monitoring program in our city, and sometimes we find birds that have hit LEED certified buildings. And so I
Yeah,
was wondering if you know if LEED has considered adding
yeah,
any bird safe measures to their
yeah.
accreditation
I
program.
Right. I'm certainly no expert on lead, but there was for a long time. It's a heavily point based system, and I believe there are optional points that you can get for fritted glass or bird safe glass, but I don't think there's anything mandatory. And maybe it was sort of in a pilot category too for a while. So I mean there have been proposals, congressional legislation that would have made it mandatory for federal buildings and GSA buildings, and I think that would be wonderful. But at this point, I don't think So you raise a good point, though. One of the examples I gave was the Jacob Javits Convention Center, and there, interestingly enough, the fritting of the glass has actually had an energy conserving benefit. So New York City's, among other things, has some very aggressive carbon reduction, you know, standards for buildings. They have to meet certain targets over time. So actually making that building bird safe or bird safer actually helps it with its carbon and energy goals. And I think that's often going to be the case. Not always, but yeah, that's a good question though.
So we have a question. You mentioned the value of tree canopies in cities. How do you apply this to cities and prairie areas, etc.? Would you advocate for just native plants, or would there be an argument for planting trees?
Yeah, I realize I'm speaking to you from the perspective of somebody in the eastern forest, eastern US, Virginia, and so on. And if you're in the prairie, I mean, there are, yes to the all the natives, right? I said we wouldn't have birds without trees, and we obviously prairie species, and there are lots of birds that are not necessarily forest oriented, or so I recognize that it's place dependent. I've been really impressed with some of the work I've been seeing around prairie pockets, and people are converting their yards to native prairie, and that's good for birds as well. I think there is a role for trees, especially in cities. Even if you are a prairie city, I think it's a highly altered sort of urban environment, and so I think there's certainly a place for them, even in a couple of our partner cities, Phoenix, Arizona, and San Francisco too kind of falls into this category. But both cities that didn't have a lot of trees, native trees, right? I mean, Phoenix is a desert essentially. San Francisco is largely a sand dune. There weren't so many trees, but I think in that highly altered urban environment, they should be, in the case of San Francisco, they should be regionally native, and they should be, California species. They shouldn't be Australian eucalyptus. But I think there's a role for trees in those urban settings, and in places like Phoenix or Tucson, there are mesquite trees. There are native species of trees, and maybe they're not found in a heavily forested kind of context. But I think that there would be legitimate ways and places for you to grow trees in prairie cities, taking advantage of native species. But yes, absolutely, prairie, prairie yards and pocket prairies, and converting all that turf grass that we have
Yes.
everywhere, right? The turf grass in residential areas, but also around institutional buildings and cities. We have all this sort of stuff that we're having to water and cut and manage that does nothing for us biologically.
Yeah, and we're a river city. We're on the Mississippi River, and
Right.
I was actually just at the Minneapolis Institute of Art and saw a painting of Fort Snelling in the 1800s, and it was,
Mm.
a river bottoms ecosystem with a lot of trees and
A lot of riparian
the
trees. Yeah.
riparian community. And so I feel
Yeah.
like, you know, maybe there's
Places
place
for that. Yeah,
place for, yeah,
certainly.
different plant communities around different
Yeah. Yeah.
biospheres.
Right.
And we have a comment: if we're planting so much vegetation close to or on buildings,
Yeah.
then the window glass better be treated,
Right.
or the increased vegetation can cause more bird glass
Yeah, that is
collisions.
absolutely right. I mean, that's a really good thing to keep in mind, that we want to make sure we're not, inviting in birds that end up then being in danger. And so that's an absolutely good point to make. And so that's why we need to think about where those mandatory, you know, fritted glass windows are. So the local law 15, if you're going to install a green roof on a building, and it's above 75 feet, it's not covered by the regular standard, then you've got to have, you've got to make those windows around it bird friendly and bird visible. So absolutely, we don't want to be inviting in birds that end up hitting and dying, because of windows. It's definitely a good point.
Yeah, so we have time for a couple more questions. I have another question. It seemed like from your talk there were like sort of three ways that cities can become biophilic, which is like through policy and regulation, and through urban planning and architectural practice, and then through these more like incentivizing or funding opportunities.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could pick like one from each of those buckets, if you could like have one of those come true for our city in terms of like bang for
Oh,
your buck. Like what would be
yeah.
like a regulatory policy you'd want to put in place, and what
Wow.
would be like just like an urban planning practice that we start
Yeah.
doing more of, and then what would be
Yeah.
a program that you would fund?
Okay. Wow. That's a great question. So regulation is the first category. Um, and the last one was a fundable program. What was the second one?
I mean, or incentivizing.
Incentivized.
The second one was just like urban planning.
A
I feel
planning
like there's like practices and
practices.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, and by city you mean Minneapolis or you mean any city?
Minneapolis. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know. It's been a long time since I've been to Minneapolis, but and I want to ask you actually about your streetlights because I remember there was not that long ago big controversies about replacing your lights with LEDs and worries about lighting. And I wonder if that's what's happened there. And that actually might be one of my answers to one of your categories. But the regulations, I'm a big fan of a lot of bottom up stuff and things, practices, as you say, as you frame it. But we are able to scale up and have a much bigger impact if we do have something that applies across a city, right? It's a minimum or a requirement, a standard. So I very much like some version of what I described for Singapore. This idea of a green standard that requires you to meet incorporate a certain amount of nature. So we sometimes in planning there's this thing called the floor area ratio (FAR), which is a way of regulating density essentially. And a lot of us are talking about a green area ratio. So like the minimum standard for Singapore, when you build that building, you've got to incorporate at least as much nature into the building as you have lost by the footprint of the building. But we could make that ratio 2 to 1 or 5 to 1 or something. And if you can't incorporate it into the building, maybe it's adjacent buildings or that there are versions of this, green spaces, green factor systems. Seattle uses one. London has a new one. They exist in a lot of places. So it's a regulation with a lot of flexibility for builders to figure out what exactly they want. Is it a green roof? Is it tree planting? What is it that they want to do or can do to meet the standard? So some standard like that. I also mentioned tree codes, and I feel like in most American cities, if you adopted a strong tree code to protect the existing trees and canopy, that would accomplish a lot. And so some of our partner cities, like Washington, D.C., has a D.C. Canopy Act. And so there are legal definitions of protected trees. It's not a perfect story, and they've got enforcement issues. But if a tree is over any large tree over a certain size is protected, and there are only certain limited circumstances where you're allowed to cut it down if it's dead or dying or causing a public hazard. Otherwise, the presumption is you need to protect it. And so I think every city should have at least a tree code that would protect the existing trees, existing canopies, and so that alone would do a lot of things for birds and for a lot of other heat and air quality and a lot of the things that we want to accomplish in cities. So in terms of practice, um, yeah, I mean, there's so many wonderful things that cities are doing to rewild. So I mentioned that wetland conversion of a water feature into a beautiful native wetland, and I feel like um, there are so many opportunities to renaturalize sterile spaces in and around cities. We already talked about this a little bit, but so Paris just announced that they're going to convert 60,000 automobile parking spaces into tree and forest planting. That's amazing. So more and more cities are moving away from mandatory parking minimums and finding ways to, promote micromobility and public transit and trying to get us out of our cars. And a typical American city, spends 25 to 40% of its space on cars. If you shift just a little bit of that, there's so many opportunities to grow more trees in nature. So I think that large category of kind of rewilding, renaturalizing is going to be even more important in the future. So what was incentivizing was one of
Yeah,
your
like paying people to
yeah,
have
yeah.
burrowing owls, or
I know, isn't that
you could
cool?
pay me. I would pay you to have a burrowing owl in my yard. Um,
Exactly. I think
or
that's right, and that's what
we have a native plant. We have a grant you can get to convert your lawn into native species.
yeah.
Um, so yes,
Yeah, and that's pretty common now, and particularly in Western states where water is they're sometimes referred to as cash for grass programs, you converting your turf grass to xeriscaping or native plants, and I think that's great, and that's not particularly radical. When we've been working around trees and forests, we're trying to push the envelope a little bit. No city, to my knowledge, has done this yet, but we'd love to see a transformation of the property tax system so that you, as a homeowner or property owner, would be given a financial incentive to protect the existing nature trees, but it could be other things as well. It could be burrowing owls. It could be, and that the more older trees you protect, the lower your taxes would be. Basically, a factoring in of the ecological benefits that protecting those trees and that nature provide for all of us, and just shifting in a very big way the financial, not just in creating an incentive, but basically changing the whole incentive structure. And even more radical would be giving people payments like that burrowing owl payment for every tree that you protect every year. Like you get this check that says, well, gosh, I just got my $100 for the 10, I just got $1,000 check for the $100 per tree, subsidy. I don't know what you'd call it from the municipal tree fund. So if you're getting $1,000 check from the city, you're not going to cut down those trees. Now you're probably going to say, well, who's going to, how are you going to fund that? And that's a good question. But
that's a
we could
really
radically,
interesting.
yeah,
Our chapter was working on a policy problem. One of our lower income neighborhoods has a lot of Dutch elm disease. And so the city will go to private property and condemn the diseased trees and take them out. But there's no replacement
no,
funding in place. And so it falls on the individual homeowners to replace those trees. and they're just not doing because it's expensive and you have to
Wow. Yeah.
maintain it and putting it in. And so that's something I've been thinking a lot about is, how, and then also the agency that takes out the trees is different than the agency that would fund and plant the new
Yeah.
trees. And so it's just, yeah, interesting to
Yeah.
think about how you can. I think a lot of people want to, they have the desire and, you know, to take these individual actions, and we really do need better support from our
Yeah.
government to
Yeah.
help people do the right thing when they, care so much.
Right. I agree. And there are a few cities that have these relief programs. We actually have one here. State Forestry Department subsidizes so actually you can get someone actually can have someone come and trim your tree for you. And if it gets cut down, if you have to cut it down, they'll cut it and then they'll actually come and replace it for you. And you get to choose what kind of tree you want. And so absolutely, we've got to make it, easy and the opposite of costly,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
agreed. Well, I don't see any more
No
questions.
more questions. I've tired
Yeah,
everybody out, except for the folks who just arrived.
yeah, and I
They're
do
waiting, they're
apologize,
waiting
but
for,
this will be on our YouTube
they have to
channel,
play the
and
tape from the beginning. Yeah.
yeah, and I did post a link to Biophilic Cities, and I believe
Yeah,
that's the website that's hosting the films that you talked about.
it is. So
And it
there's a
also,
drop
yeah.
down, you can find films. There's like a film page. Yeah.
And then there's a link to your book, Bird Friendly City, there, which
Okay,
is
great.
how I was became acquainted with you and your work. And then the Biophilic Cities also lists out how a city can join the network.
That's right.
And so if anyone is interested in helping Minneapolis join the Biophilic
We
Cities
would love to
network,
have you. That would be great.
it lays out the steps. And I think it would involve working with a civil servant, an elected government official to get a
Yeah,
resolution passed. And
right.
you can reach out to me or,
Could
uh,
be your group.
yeah.
You all could be advocates, which actually how it happens. So often that Washington D.C., for example, there was a group called Biophilic D.C. They lobbied the city council. They went to every council member and educated them about this, and they adopted the resolution and joined. And so it often takes some group, an organization in that city to push for it. So we're ready to help you. If you're interested, we can give a presentation to the mayor's office or city council or anybody. And yeah, it'd be great to have Minneapolis in the program.
Would be wonderful. I hope that we're in touch about that soon.
Great.
So I wanted to thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you, Dr. Beatley, for sharing your wonderful work on biophilic cities. We will be posting this on our website, and I do apologize. There was an Eastern/Central time zone kerfuffle on the Zoom link. We did post the correct time on our website and in the announcement, but if you are tuning in a little later, we'll put this on our YouTube channel and you can watch from start to finish. And then we'll also include these really useful links in our the YouTube uh, blurbs, as they call it. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. And thank you, Dr. Beatley.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Good night, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.